thing to move on the slides. Here we are.
All right.
Well, look, thanks. It's great to be here. Thank you very much. I'm a dermatologist, so I'm a clinician, and I spend half my week seeing patients and half the week doing research. And I'm usually the only person in the room that likes sunlight. So this, for me, is a very unusual situation to be in. So thank you. Shall I head on with my talk?
Absolutely. Just to give a little bit of a background, folks, know about the interesting journey that you have had. You started your study of medicine in University of London. Then your studies and research took you around the world. You studied internal medicine in Northern London and Australia. Then you did training in dermatology in Edinburgh, and then you went to University of Pittsburgh, and in Edinburgh, University of Pittsburgh, you did further research. And what Professor Ware is sharing today is data-driven breakthrough scientific discovery that it really challenges our notion about how we understand the role of light and sunlight with health. And I think we will be really interested to learn more about how your systemic approach as a dermatologist really changes the paradigm. So we're looking forward.
Well, thank you very much indeed. So look, I do a lot of types of research, and very much driven by the fact I'm also a clinician, and I spent a lot of time seeing patients. I should also add, I was at Heinrich Heine in Düsseldorf doing research, and had the best training and supervision I ever had actually was in Germany. My wonderful boss there, studying nitric oxide. And part of my research, my initial research was mechanistic research, looking at, I started off being a good boy in dermatology terms, thinking sunlight was bad for you, because that's what you're taught. And I was there initially in Düsseldorf and then in Pittsburgh trying to work out the mechanisms of this. And I still do a lot of mechanistic research, but the data has led me to the opposite view, led by the data. And I've shifted to also doing epidemiological research, whole population stuff, because that tells you the big picture. Is it good or bad? And then mechanistic research tells you how it's good or bad. So today I'm going to concentrate on the epidemiological research because I've only got 12 minutes. And I think that's really of relevance to this audience. So this is me, this is Edinburgh as the sun sets. It's not raining, but they grabbed the picture, it was so unusual. So, and I suppose I'm going to start off talking about sunlight. And of course, we have a really different attitude to sunlight now. Well, not in this room. Outside this room, people have a very different attitude to sunlight now to the attitude they had 100 years ago. So, of course, 100 years ago, you went off, Rollier, you went off to the Alps for the sanatoria to treat tuberculosis. In Britain, you were shoved in front of a UV lamp. After Finson's discovery, to prevent your rickets. If you live in Scotland, so this is actually my hospital in Edinburgh. In 1950, we couldn't afford Davos. We still can't afford Davos. But what we could afford were these little garden sheds on a railway turntable. And we would put patients with TB in these little garden sheds and face them at the sun. And if you lived in Glasgow, you could have a cage for your child outside your apartment. So, well, the Glaswegians tell us it was to prevent rickets. What we know in Edinburgh was this was preparing Glasgow children for life behind bars. So opinions differ. So that was then. And this is a dermatologist on holiday today. Now, dermatologists do not go to the gym a lot, I accept, but we have beautiful skin. Okay, and what has led to this change in attitude in the last 100 years? And of course, it's this. This is what we hear about sunlight. In the UK, sun smart, avoid the sun. In Germany, bleiben Sie sicher, keep out of the sun. In France, le soleil, protégez-vous. So this is what we put out about sun now. And that, of course, is fears about skin cancer driven by dermatologists. Now, I haven't got time to talk about that today, but the fears about melanoma in particular and how much of it can be attributed to sunlight are vastly overestimated due to incredibly faulty reasoning. There's not time for that today, but the hazards are nothing like as big as dermatologists say. But I suppose my interest, in medicine, you tend to start with epidemiology. You know, what's the big picture? Do smokers have shorter lives or longer lives? They have shorter lives, so it is a problem. Do people who do not do exercise have shorter or longer lives? They have shorter lives, so lack of exercise is a problem. You know, that's how we build on things. So what's the big picture for sunlight? Do people that get more sunlight have shorter lives or longer lives? And no dermatologist has ever done that. They've instantly got into mechanism and how to avoid it without standing back and asking the big picture first. Is it a problem? Does it shorten lives? So the first person to do this was now a friend of mine, Pelle Lindqvist at the Karolinska, who's an obstetrician. No dermatologists were involved in these studies, okay? So Pelle is an obstetrician, and Pelle goes moose hunting every winter. He's a true Swede. And he was chatting in the sauna after a hard day's moose hunting with a friend of his who had this data set, the melanoma in southern Sweden study. So this study was set up in 1990 in Sweden. It recruited 30,000 middle-aged Swedish women in southern Sweden, which was a significant part of the population then. And the aim was to find how much sunlight causes melanoma and how it kills you. It was meant to estimate how dangerous sunlight is. So each of the, you can answer these questions in your head. Each of these Swedish women was asked 4 questions. Do you sunbathe in summer? Do you sunbathe in winter, Sweden? They're strange people. Do you go on foreign holidays? Do you use tanning beds? Now, obviously, there are confounders associated with this. If you go on foreign holidays, you're richer, so you're probably better educated, so et cetera, et cetera. But if all of that was adjusted for, so they adjusted for lifestyle factors, you know, exercise, smoking, social factors, income, education, and health factors like pregnancy, marital status. Remember, being married is bad for women and good for men. A married couple has the same mean life expectancy as a man and a woman, except the woman has taken the hit, and I thank my wife every day for taking the hit for me. So all of that was adjusted for. So they went back 25 years later to find out what had happened. The first thing to say was those that had the most sunlight were more likely to be diagnosed with a melanoma. So that's the first thing. So that was expected. And the expectation was more melanoma and more death. That was the expectation. But what they found was the complete opposite. So what you have on the left here is your sunlight score, 0 to 4, 4 being those naughty people, dermatologically speaking, who get lots of sunlight. And they were half as likely to be dead as those people who avoided the sun altogether. And in fact, the size of the effect was as big as smoking, but in the opposite direction. So people that got lots of sunlight and smoked had the same life expectancy as non-smokers who avoid the sun. And smoking's the most bad thing you can do for your health, okay? It is absolutely worse. That is the size of the effect. What was really interesting, a particular and a major reduction in cardiovascular deaths, so much so that there was an apparent increase in cancer deaths, but it was apparent because people weren't dying of heart disease, and something has to get you. So there wasn't, but it wasn't a real increase. So that was Sweden. Now Sweden's a bijou little country, very nice, but there's not many of them. So we thought, so let's have a look in the UK population. And what has really made this possible is we now have these huge, great prospective cohort studies in countries like Britain. So the UK Biobank is so far the biggest prospective cohort study in the world. So 500,000 people in Britain were recruited. I was one of them, between 40 and 60. Obviously, I was at the younger end of I just squeezed in. And so it took about 3 years to recruit them all. It was from 2000 till 2003, and this cost tens of millions of pounds to run. And the team went around Britain, 14 major centres in Britain, and each of those 500,000 people had about a 3-hour assessment, huge, great questionnaires on health behaviour, lots of measurements taken, blood stored against future technologies which are now being used. So we're now doing whole transcriptome sequencing, whole proteome, because those blood were stored. So it was an incredibly well set up study and has produced a mass of really important data. And from my point of view, one of the really good things in that data set was they asked 8 questions or 6 questions related to sunlight exposure. Now, of course, like the melanoma in southern Sweden study, they were designed to find how dangerous sunlight is. That was the expectation. Doesn't matter. The data was collected. So we wanted to find questions that would indicate how much sunlight people got. And we honed down on the 2 best questions we could find. One was a behavioral marker, and it was sunbed users, solarium users. And now, to avoid frightening dermatologists, we have called them sun seekers, but you know what I mean. And we call them sun seekers because actually people that go to tanning salons, we know behaviorally like the sun. They actively get out and sunbathe more. They expose more of their flesh to the sun. It is a behavioral marker. And the second measure we used was a geographical marker. It was how far south people live. So that was our second independent marker. Now, obviously, you need to adjust for confounders because people who use sunbeds are different from the general population. People who live further south are different from the general population. And you have to get in and adjust for confounders. So, for instance, sunbed users are younger, more female, more likely to come from Manchester, more likely to smoke, more like there's a whole series. So you adjust for all of those factors, exercise, everything else. And you adjust for those same factors in the people who live further south. Now, what is important here, all observational studies, and this is an observational study, not an interventional studies, all observational studies carry the risk of uncontrolled for confounding. We're worried there's something, maybe knitting whilst doing the Times crossword for a mechanism we've never thought about is actually associated with sunlight and makes you live longer. I mean, so you're always implausible, but who knows? You're always concerned there's something you haven't adjusted for that might account for your results. But what is important here, and this is a kind of epidemiological gold standard, is that the confounders move differently for our 2 measures. So the confounders behave differently in sun seekers than they do in people who live further south. And that makes it unlikely that there is an uncorrected for confounder accounting for our results. The other thing we did was we used, so vitamin D has some benefits, not many. It prevents rickets. It doesn't do much beyond that. But vitamin D in the blood is a biomarker for sunlight exposure. Now, we know from the huge number of clinical trials of giving people vitamin D that aside from preventing rickets and maybe some autoimmune diseases, it doesn't do much else. Vitamin D levels in the blood are a great marker for sunlight exposure, and you can use it to confirm that our 2 measures for sunlight are accurate. So here are our patients. So there were 400,000 people we recruited, and we went in 12 years later after this to analyze the data. And what we're interested in is death. And so we adjusted for age, obesity, gender, deprivation, exercise, all of these factors. So all of this was adjusted for that. And in the sun seekers, we adjusted for lassitude, and in the southerners, we adjusted for sun-seeking behavior. So what did we find? Headline figures. Well, first of all, our measure of sunlight, this is the sun seekers, and so solarium use is a good indicator for people getting sunlight because they have much higher vitamin D levels. So that's great. We know this is a good indicator for sunlight exposure. So what happens to those sun seekers? And by the way, I'm supposed to be out there telling people never to do this. It's terrible, evil behavior. So this is their all-cause mortality and type-specific mortality 12 years after they were enrolled. So sun seekers were 15% less likely to be dead from any cause than non-sun seekers. In particular, that was due to a reduction in cardiovascular deaths, a 23% reduction in cardiovascular deaths, just as Peli has shown in Sweden. And they were 14% less likely to be dead from cancer. And then also the other factors, which is the third grouping, things like multiple sclerosis and diabetes, also had reduced deaths. And in fact, they had, after 12 years, they had a 50-day longer life expectancy. Now, none of you follow British politics. It's a fairly tawdry thing. That is longer than Liz Truss was Prime Minister, okay? So, you know, so look, my advertisement to dermatologists is, you know, don't use the sunbed and you don't get Liz Truss. I mean, that's a strong argument for avoiding sunlight. Anyway, there we are. And so what about melanoma? Well, there was an increase in diagnoses of melanoma incidence, but no rise in deaths from melanoma. But the numbers were small, and those figures are not significant. But the other thing here is, and the other cancers greatly reduced, and you know, a big reduction in cancers like blood cancers, lymphatic cancers, breast cancer, cervical cancer, you know, so all of those cancers. So that's our first measure of sunlight exposure. What about our second? So the further south you live. So the further south you live, the more UV there is, and dose-dependently, the higher vitamin D levels are. So we know that southerniness is a good indicator of sunlight exposure. What happens here? So this is the difference between Glasgow, close to where I live in Edinburgh, and Truro. Munich, somewhere down here, you lucky things. Okay, so 12% reduction in all cause, again, 19, particular reduction in cardiovascular, 19%, cancer deaths, 12% down. For every 300 kilometers further out you live, 16 days longer life expectancy after 12 years. Maybe it's longer with more lifespan. So, you know, me to London would be a month of increased lifespan. And again, a trend to increase melanoma incidence, no rise in deaths, and all the other cancers down. So that we published that last year. Dermatologists grudgingly accepting it because it's hard data. And I'm just showing some data. We're actually working on this manuscript now. So we thought, let's get in and do a comparative analysis of skin cancer deaths versus other things. So this is work we're just writing up at the moment, and we'll be submitting in a couple of weeks. So we've gone back in, and we've pulled 4 1 minutes. Okay, we've pulled 4 of our indicated sunlight exposure to get a better score. So what we've done here is we looked at, you know, the sun seekers, and we're either giving them a 1 for using it, a no for not. Outdoor time, you know, we divided people in those that get more outdoor time and less. UV protection. So interestingly, if you use UV protection, if you use sunscreen, you get the sun, okay? So actually UV protection is a marker for going in the sun. People that, so we can divide that. And the latitude. So, and again, we validated against vitamin D. And what we've done now is we can divide our population up into high, medium, and low sun seekers. So, what happens? So, medium sun seekers have an 11% increased lifespan over low sun seekers. High have a 17%. There's a dose dependency here. And again, cardiovascular, 15% reduction in medium, 25% in high. So we're getting a dose reduction. The more sunlight you get, dose dependently, this reduction in causes of death. So what we can then do with these figures, we can work out, and the other thing I should say was now, so it's now 15 years after recruitment, and the great thing about epidemiology is the longer you wait, the more people die and the better your data gets. I look at my epidemiology colleagues drinking cups of coffee saying, you should be doing some work. They say, I'm waiting. That for them is that I have to go to the lab. In my next life, I shall be an epidemiologist. Okay, so the data is now better and stronger, and we're getting a slight signal for increased melanoma deaths in those that get the most sun. But we can quantify how big that is. I'm going to run through maths. Basically, deaths in the UK attributable to sunlight. So 11% of melanoma deaths in the UK are attributable to sunlight, and 9% of non-melanoma skin cancers. However, all-cause mortality minus 6.8. So there is a sparing effect from all-cause death with sunlight. That is particularly marked with cardiovascular deaths and then cancer. So what does this mean at population level? So in the UK Biobank, 15 years after enrolled, we had 34,000 deaths, cancer's the biggie, then cardiovascular, and then down here, melanoma. So what proportion of these deaths can be attributed to sunlight? So you multiply the number of deaths by the population attributable fraction due to sunlight. So of the 400,000 people in the Biobank, 40 melanoma deaths were due to UV, so 1 in 10,000 people. has died of melanoma caused by UV, and one in 80,000 has died of non-melanoma skin cancer. However, the figures are the other way for all-cause death. So 831 cancer deaths could be attributed to insufficient sunlight. 2,300 deaths due to all-cause deaths due to insufficient sunlight. And although the relative sparing for cancer is only 5%, so many people die of cancer that this really makes a big difference. For every melanoma death you prevent by sunlight avoidance, you cause 45 excess deaths from other causes. And dermatologists have only been concerned by that melanoma death. They have been uninterested in the vastly greater number, orders of magnitude greater number of other deaths. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for super interesting talk, showing us how thinking outside of our disciplines might actually change the paradigm and looking at data. Super exciting and interesting. We have time for a couple of questions.
Usually people throw things at me at this stage. It's very nice to be...
There's a question there.
Yeah.
Thank you. It sounds so familiar because I've spent the best 6 years of my life in Edinburgh and the past 14 years in London. So I'm just actually now weighing my chances of a long life. So I'm still a big believer in the power of NHS to change something despite all the changes and messes. So I'm wondering how the results and implications of this cohort study have been reflected to the practices and policies of the NHS.
Yeah, really good question. And I'm really pleased that we're talking here about change. The whole theme of this is how to enact change. So look, I'm doing a lot of mechanistic work too with Amaya Viris, who's a Spanish researcher in Manchester. So we think, so Amaya is Spanish, and we're just submitting a mechanistic paper to one of the major biomedical journals at the moment. So we think that a significant reason for our poor cancer mortality in Britain compared to Southern Europe may be nothing to do with failures of service delivery, only partially, but actually bloody geography, okay? We are the least sunny part of Europe. Not only are we far north, but we have lots of cloud cover. And we think there are fundamental things here. Changing policy is really hard, and this is where I really, really battle. My specialty, dermatologists, have demonized sunlight, even though the data on which they base it is absolute garbage. I mean, it's just dreadful data. Now we've got these great big prospective cohorts. You can get in detail and look at it. Much better data. This is what you show. Science is self-correcting. It will change. But trying to move this huge, great institutional, we oppose sunlight thing is incredibly hard. I'm trying to do it from within the dermatology world, but you know, and in the end, I believe that data is what does it, having the science. But you're up against, look, increasingly within Europe, people understand this. I'm increasingly talking to European dermatology associations, and most dermatologists get it. But a lot of people have invested their life in this anti-sun message. That's who they are. It's a cult. It is a cult. You know, you're a dermatologist, you hate sunlight. That's your job. And yet, the official line is that 90% of melanoma is caused by sunlight. It is total pants. I haven't got time to go into. I published on it if you want. Absolutely garbage. Whereas 75% of smoking is caused by lung cancer is caused by smoking. 70% of lung cancer is caused by smoking. Okay. You say to dermatologists, it's a sunny day, do you sit at your desk at lunchtime puffing away on 20 Woodbine because you know what's good for you? Or no dermatologist believes that sunlight is more dangerous than smoking. None of them. But that is our official policy statement. None of them believe it. You ask them, do you believe it? No, of course I don't. But that is the official policy statement. So you're pushing against institutional sluggishness, and you know that's correct. Most new ideas are wrong, and I accept that. You know, it's putting that data out there, saying what are we thinking about, and also the other problem is we're all very siloed. For me, it's amazing being here, meeting all these architects and circadian biologists. You know, I live in the dermatology world, and it's sunlight and skin cancer. Cardiovascular people, Richard Weller's a dermatologist. Who's Richard Weller? Dermatologist, never heard of him. You know, cancer people, who's Richard Weller? Dermatologist, never heard of him. In the dermatology world, why is Richard interested in blood pressure? And, you know, so we live in these silos and trying to get that together. So I don't know what the answer is, but it really is important.
We have time for one quick question. There's one hand over there, but I know there's a lot of conversations that we need to continue maybe after the session, in the lunch and in the coffee break. One more.
Thank you, Richard. I'll be very brief. There are epidemiological data which point to an increase in melanoma, at least in Europe. So what I don't understand, where does this then come from, that there's an increase? And if the argument is wrong, what's going on there? But from your nodding, I see the argument is right.
Where are you from, out of interest?
Well, I work at the UCL School of Pharmacy in London.
Okay, so there is a huge rise in incidence, not deaths, incidence of melanoma. So in Denmark, in the last 70 years, cases of melanoma have gone up 20-fold, deaths unchanged. In America, in the last 40 years, cases of melanoma have gone up 6-fold, deaths unchanged. In Britain, since I started my career 27 years ago, cases of melanoma have gone up 3-fold, deaths unchanged. We are now realizing, a mass of papers out in the last 2 years, we are now realizing this is almost certainly a case of what we call overdiagnosis. The more you look for melanoma, the more you find it. Nothing would have happened if you hadn't found it, okay? So your biggest risk factor for being diagnosed with melanoma in America is being rich. So there is no correlation with how sunny it is where you live. So melanoma screening, so Germany, the whole of Germany had melanoma screening for 2 years in 2000, made absolutely no difference to melanoma deaths, because what we're trying to do is stop people dying of disease, okay? So screening has been shown to have no effect on stopping people dying from melanoma. And none of us can understand why Americans do this mole checks every 6 months. So in America, obviously if you're rich, you go to your dermatologist every 6 months for a mole check, never shown to assess melanoma. The rest of us can't understand why they do this. And then you see what they are doing is they are removing that dangerous money from their patients, making them poorer and thus safer. And the truly heroic bit, because my brother-in-law is a soldier. I said, my God, it's like bomb disposal squad. And bomb disposal, cowards. They take the bomb, take it somewhere far over there and blow it up. American dermatologists take that money home. It's like taking the bombs. The heroism and self-sacrifice of so there is this huge epidemic of but no change in deaths. It's like prostate cancer. If you do autopsies in men who are run over by who have heart attacks or die of whatever, fall off mountains when they're 80. 20% of them have got prostate cancer. They never knew. Now we have this blood test, the PSA blood test. You do this blood test, there's an epidemic of prostate cancer. Amount of prostate cancer has not changed. We have a blood test. For the vast majority of men, that makes no difference. And it is the same with melanoma. So the way they've calculated this 90% of melanoma is caused by sunlight is they have gone to historical data. Oh gosh, in Denmark, there was hardly any melanoma 70 years ago. You go to the earliest birth cohort you can find, and you compare the incidence, cases, not deaths, cases of melanoma then, and you compare it with cases now. So that's the first invention. There is no change in the amount of melanoma. The second invention is you then say, oh, they had no sunlight then, and we have lots of sun. That's the second invention. So in an era before electricity, television, screens, we say, oh, they sat inside knitting in the dark. And now there are, so you have these two inventions together, garbage in, garbage out. I could use more fruity language. And you produce this utterly fictitious character. And dermatologists, and so that is dreadful for our attribution. The other thing I might say in Britain, a publicly funded service, so Edinburgh, where I am, has 3 times as many dermatologists as when I started. We're diagnosing 3 times as melanoma. The government sets up these figures. Cancers have to be seen within 2 weeks. So in my department, despite a huge increase in dermatologists, we have not booked in to the department a single case of eczema, psoriasis, acne, urticaria since March of last year, over a year ago. Despite a tripling of the workforce, if you're one of those conditions, you will never see a dermatologist, because we are chasing this non-existent epidemic due to a government target. So it's bad because it gives a false attribution of risk to sunlight, and it's catastrophic for delivery of healthcare. So
thank you so much.